This is Distant Replay, the podcast that goes back in time to relive all the greatest events that we witnessed in sports. From upsets, to championships, to cultural moments, we discuss it all. Coming up on today's episode.
You got to make anybody but LeBron James hit a shot here.
Singles coverage with Phillips on James. Working him down. 5 seconds. 4, 3. James scores with 2.2 to go. The Cavaliers lead 109-107, and the Pistons call for time.
I'm shocked.
Time to go back to May 31st, 2007, the Eastern Conference Finals, the 2006-2007 NBA season. We are inside the Palace of Auburn Hills for the Cavs, Pistons, Game 5. LeBron going up against the Pistons, who were in the middle of their dynasty. This was an all-timer and maybe the breakout game of LeBron's career. And now we've since seen him do amazing things in the NBA. So we're going to go back to this day in 2007 for this episode of the Distant Replay podcast. Glad to have you on the show. I am Ben George. He is Mike Noto. And we go back to NBA, Mike. We haven't done a lot of NBA games, but I think a lot of the ones we'll probably do early on are going to involve LeBron.
Yeah, we already have one LeBron game up, the Spurs Heat Game 6 from the NBA Finals with the famous Ray Allen shot. And then there are a couple other moments I think of when I think of LeBron James and his performance in this game, Game 5 versus the Pistons in the Eastern Conference Finals, is one that stood out. So I thought it was a must-do for the podcast.
It was a good call. I'd kind of forgotten about this game. I mean, admittedly, I'm not the biggest NBA fan. I like all sports. I mean, obviously we do a sports history podcast. You got to be a fan of just about everything in order to do that. But I haven't kept up with the NBA as closely as I do a lot of other sports. So, some of these things kind of fall through the cracks. I remember these teams a lot, but I don't remember a lot of the details about the game. So going back to this one was really good. And we're going to do that over the course of this episode. We're going to really, a lot of this is kind of setting the stage for this game. The Pistons, the Cavs, kind of the franchises where they are in their history, and then kind of what's come after this for both teams as well. And of course, LeBron. So we'll go through that today. Some outdated stuff to get to, go down the rosters quite a bit. So looking forward to this show. If you are just joining us for the first time, you can find us at Distant Replay Podcast. We're going to put this game up as it aired in its entirety. That's the way we watched it on YouTube. We'll put the YouTube video on our website there, so go find it. But also connect with us on YouTube. We have our own channel. We put all of our episodes up there. Got a great following over there, and we appreciate everybody's support, all the comments we've gotten on the page and on the videos, and the requests and recommendations we've gotten for shows. So keep those coming. We definitely appreciate that. Subscribe, spread the word. And also connect with us on Twitter and Instagram as well. So a lot of ways to get in touch with us, and we do appreciate everyone that has been a part of the show. It's been a lot of fun so far. I want to keep it rolling with today's show on the Eastern Conference Finals. So where do we need to start, Mike? I guess LeBron, right? LeBron's the headliner, kind of getting a feel for where he is right now in his career. So kind of give me a little perspective, because this is surprisingly only the second playoff appearance for LeBron.
Yeah, so LeBron's career is so long, some of the time periods of his career sort of muddle together. Although he's had like 4 different stops, it helps kind of put in perspective the different phases of his legendary career. And this is early LeBron James. This is 22 years old, only his second playoff run. His first playoff run ended the year before in the Eastern Conference semifinal against these same Pistons in 7 games. So yet again, we have another iconic superstar in LeBron James having to go through the Pistons to really make his mark in the NBA. Ben, does that sound familiar?
Yeah. There's no question about that. And, we've had a lot of the arguments between those two guys since this game, and, probably we'll have those forever. Jordan versus LeBron will be the same. So it is kind of interesting the way they're parallels early in their career.
Yeah, for sure. And two Piston teams, different eras, but sort of built the same way. Just similarities in, the way these two teams even played, the late 80s, early 90s Pistons and this, mid-2000s Pistons team, just brought me back. So I thought that was an interesting parallel.
Yeah, and they were pretty hard-nosed too, kind of like those old Pistons teams. We saw hard foul in this game. They had talked about kind of some of the hard fouls they had on the Cavs the year prior as well. So there's a bit of that as well. So it is an interesting parallel there between those two all-time greats. LeBron, and we knew kind of where LeBron was in terms of a player. I mean, we had all the coverage of him in high school. He comes out 03-04, first year, rookie of the year. So, I mean, he's already kind of living up to expectations, but we haven't seen him quite at that level of greatness that everybody expects him to get to eventually. But until you get there, I mean, no matter who you are, until you actually reach the pinnacle, there's always going to be questions. So that's kind of where we are going into this matchup because the year prior, I mean, and he brought the Cavs out of the bottom of the barrel of the Eastern Conference, right? I mean, the year before he even joined the team, they had 17 wins. Okay, so they were very bad, and they had gotten close to making the playoffs, and they finally get in, as you mentioned, get to the second round, which was a nice, obviously big for Cleveland, the city, the fan base, and now here they are back to this point, conference finals this time for the first time in a long time, and they're facing off against this team that has been a dynasty in the NBA. So, but the question is, can LeBron actually finish off the series? That's sort of storyline, not only leading into it, but throughout this game.
Yeah, and this is the first season where I can remember LeBron James being under a serious microscope as far as, can he win the big one? The first, it tends to be a lot this way with these young high school guys that come out. The first 2 or 3 years of their career, it's all like, wow, look how great this young guy is. We're more focused on his highlights and how, they wow us, every night with different dunks and different nice moves. And then it becomes about the winning, right? Everyone's career comes down to the winning. And you talked about him reaching the pinnacle before. Now remember, someone in his draft class had already reached the pinnacle the year before in Dwayne Wade. So I think that put even more pressure on LeBron coming into this particular season. And you mentioned the Pistons. The Pistons are the class of the Eastern Conference at this time. All right.
Yep.
And this is their 5th year, the 5th of what would be 6 years, where this Pistons squad made the Eastern Conference Finals or better. Which, when I went back and researched this, I hadn't realized it had been this is the 5th season of 6 that they at least advanced to the Eastern Conference Finals. If you look back in the history of basketball, there's not many teams and franchises that have done that.
No, there's not. And this was really a franchise that was, one of the top 4 or 5 in the NBA, right? I mean, right beyond the Lakers, the Bulls, Celtics. I mean, the Pistons are pretty close to that, especially in this time period because of what they did in the 80s. The 90s weren't the best decade for them, but they kind of carried that into the early 2000s where they put together a roster that's impressive. And when they showed the starting lineups in this game, there's a huge discrepancy between the Cavs roster and the Pistons starting 5. I mean, even beyond that, obviously, but just looking at starting 5s, I mean, if you took LeBron off this team, and I think this is kind of what the argument's been for a lot of his career in Cleveland, but if you take LeBron off that team, that team's not even anywhere close to sniffing a conference finals.
There's reason why, like, even when people still talk about LeBron's career, even to this day, they talk about the biggest accomplishments for him, right? They'll mention the Warriors run when they beat the Warriors in 7 games in the finals. But someone will always bring up, man, he took that 2000 Cavs team to the finals. And that is this team that we're talking about right now. And the reason they say that is because of the lack of talent around him. Okay? Now, the lack of talent around him would ultimately be the reason why he would leave Cleveland the first time around. But we're right in the middle of his Cleveland run here. And the starting 5, along with James, was Drew Gooden, Zydrunas Ilgauskas, Sasha Pavlovich, and Larry Hughes. Off the bench would be a rookie in Daniel Boobie Gibson, who I think people will remember because he actually emerged a little bit in this playoff run and played good for the Cavs.
Right.
You had Anderson Varejao, who would become a staple on the Cavs. You had Damon Jones and Danielle Marshall. I mean, these are names but they're not names, and we even saw this, we'll get into it later, during spurts where LeBron James was not in the game for the Cavs, it was very hit or miss as far as their offensive production.
Yeah, not to take away anything from this lineup, because, I mean, obviously we're not NBA players, Mike, so it's not like we can critique somebody's talent level. But it feels like this is a team made up of 6 men. You know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
I was going to say role players, but even beyond that.
Good team defenders. That's what all these guys were in their defense, right? And Mike Brown, who was more of a defensive-minded coach. This is his 2nd year with the Cavs. And all these guys were good team defensive players. It's just from an offensive standpoint, they struggled to get points to the point where Boobie Gibson was their second option.
Hard to believe, right? Other side was Flip Saunders and the Detroit Pistons. Flip was in year 2, I believe, as well. with the Pistons. But you look down this roster, and I mean it's a loaded top to bottom, off the bench roster. You know, Chauncey Billups, obviously, this is kind of the pinnacle of his career too, right? I mean, this kind of 3-4 year stretch, he was really good. Tayshaun Prince could do it on both ends, great defender as well. Then you had Rasheed Wallace, who we've talked about on the show, and who was part of that the Malice in the Palace, which we've done an episode on, which was only a few years prior to this. He was on there, but Chris Webber had come back for a year to play in Detroit, and I forgot this was the only year he played in Detroit. You had Rip Hamilton, the scorer. You even had Antonio McDyess, who came in off the bench, gave him some minutes there. I mean, this was a very good lineup, top to bottom.
Just a solid veteran team led by a solid veteran coach. You know, Flip Saunders came into a pretty tough situation when, you know, in the middle of this run we talked about, 6 seasons, Eastern Conference Finals or better, you know, Flip Saunders has to come in and replace Larry Brown. You know, so
yep.
No easy task on his part. He did a great job with this team taking over. You have the consummate veteran bunch here. Billups, Wallace, Prince, Hamilton, you know, were with the Pistons throughout this entire run. Then you throw in veterans like Chris Webber, Antonio McDyess, Lindsey Hunter, Jason Maxiell, you know, just steady veteran guys. They played a team brand of basketball where not one guy dominated the ball. But at the same time, they had very talented players, and that's why this mixed work for as long as it did. As you mentioned, we're back at the Palace at Auburn Hills, and this is an era of Detroit basketball.
Love
okay,
that,
the
yeah.
Pistons are huge at this point. They're top 5 in the league in attendance every year, even peaking at number 1 or 2 some years. So this is a very, very good time to be a fan of the Pistons. You have a young LeBron James coming in, you know, in a very, very, these game 5s of these playoff series are ultra important and just set the scene for a great night in Auburn Hills.
Yeah, we'll tell you about the 4 games leading up to this one in just a second. I want to just kind of give you some context on where we are in the NBA. Eastern Conference, these were the top 2 teams during the regular season. Pistons, 53 wins. Cavs had 50. On the other side, Western Conference, the best team that year by record, the Mavs. The Mavs won 67 games that season, followed by the Suns, who won 61 as well. Then the Spurs, who were your defending champions, had won 58 games that year. So a really quality NBA season, but I think all the heavyweights were in the West still.
Oh, for sure. So at this point, as of this game, the Spurs had already won the Western Conference Finals and were waiting in the finals for the winner of this. But those 3 teams you just mentioned, you mentioned the Mavericks, who were coming off the finals the year before, first the Heat. You mentioned one of those classic Steve Nash Suns teams, Steve Nash, Mike D'Antoni Suns teams, and then the Spurs, you know, the Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, Tony Parker Spurs. So, yeah, the strength very much in the West at this point. But the East, again, the steady Pistons, and a young LeBron James.
Yeah, and good job catching me on that. Spurs were not the defending champions. They won it 2 years prior. So either way, the Spurs are right there in the heyday of their time as well. And so it's a very good NBA period. And now we're just waiting to see who comes out of the East. Will it be this young upstart LeBron and the Cavs, or this veteran, well-tested, rugged, veteran Pistons team? So these Eastern Conference Finals, looking back to the series, we're now game 5. This was a very good series from start to finish, maybe until the final game. But yeah, Detroit won the first 2 games, both by the score of 79-76. Identical first 2 games. Cavs go back home, first time hosting a home playoff Eastern Conference Final game in a while. They win the next 2, win by 6, then win by 4. So, I mean, this is essentially a dead even series by score. Cavs are up maybe by a few points, but almost dead even going into game 5. And I think that kind of sets the tone for what to expect. Marv Albert says it coming in here, like, hey, a lot of the Pistons fans thought they'd be coming to game 5 looking to close it out, especially after the way that series started. But now they're just trying to stay alive and ward off this Cavs team who's come on strong.
Yeah, and you got to remember, this series last year went to 2-2 as well. You know what I mean? So they're coming off a 1-7 games rather the year before. So they're coming off a dogfight the year before. They're in another dogfight now. You notice some of the scores in these games, with 91 being the highest offensive output for any team before game 5. So this era of NBA basketball loaded with with iconic talent, right? Because of all those teams we mentioned before, we didn't even mention, the fact that Kobe Bryant's still in the league. You have Nowitzki, Duncan, Nash, LeBron, these Pistons teams. But this is not an era known for offensive productivity. And that's why the Suns were such a special team, right? Because they kind of brought that element when not a lot of other teams did. So you have a very much a grinded out series going on at this point. LeBron starting to come on, as they mentioned, in the fourth quarters in games 3 and 4, maybe giving us a little bit of a precursor of what was to come in game 5.
I know. Think about it, man. 79-76 were two of the finals in this series. 79-76. I mean, that those are third quarter scores right now in the NBA. It's crazy to think about.
It is, and this is just the era. This is just the era. I mean, if you look from, let's say the Jordan era up through this era, it was really the same kind of basketball. It didn't really change in terms of scores.
Yeah.
The high scoring games of the 80s are a long thing of the past as we head into this 2007 playoffs.
No question. So let's jump into this game. Mike, this was TNT. Had the coverage. Great broadcast crew as well, by the way. I mentioned Marv Albert already. The legendary voice was on the call, but he was joined by Steve Kerr and Doug Collins. What a crew.
Yeah, so when all is said and done, all three of those guys will be in the Basketball Hall of Fame, right?
Yeah.
For different reasons. You know what I mean? Marv for announcing reasons, Collins for announcing and playing and coaching, and Kerr mainly for coaching, I would imagine. But, they brought unique perspectives to the game. I thought they meshed well from a personality standpoint. They joked with each other during the game. I thought that gave Marv tends to lighten things up a little bit with his, with the people announcing with him. I thought that was a good, sort of a good aspect to it. And of course, Craig Sager on the sidelines, who was just always a breath of fresh air when they threw it to him. Yeah.
Oh, Craig Sager, man. He was great and great interviewer, and he got some good conversations during this game as well. But it's interesting because Kerr obviously would go on to be with the Warriors now, reaching new heights. And then, even Doug Collins came back for a few years with Philadelphia. He had long since coached, obviously, with Michael Jordan, had coached these Pistons, but then actually still coached again. So they had two NBA coaches, future coaches, on this crew. So very good call, and you obviously got a lot of good perspective and basketball knowledge from these guys throughout this game as they kind of drew it up and talked about these matchups and strategy and everything as we went along. So really good broadcasting crew.
Do you ever, real quick here, do you ever feel bad for other play-by-play guys when you hear Marv Albert call a game? He's the best by a mile.
I mean, Costas still, for me, I guess it depends on sport, maybe too, for you. But, man, listening to Costas is still as good as it gets, I think.
So Marv is great. So I grew up listening to Marv Albert, right? Obviously. Marv on basketball, and if you ever get a chance to listen to an old hockey game when Marv used to do hockey, he was even great in hockey. Yeah. That's where Kenny gets it from. You know Kenny Albert?
Right.
Yeah. But Marv Albert is just one of a kind. Great announcer. Still announcing to this day. So
there you go. I love Marv. No doubt about it. So let's jump into this one, Mike. Again, we're just going to kind of give some thoughts on each quarter as it goes along. Great atmosphere, as you mentioned, the Detroit basketball kind of brought back memories, man. That was such a great period for Detroit and the NBA, and a time which I really enjoyed as well. But, we got these lineups again. I thought what was interesting, too, about this, and I guess maybe it was kind of a Mike Brown thing, but they pointed out early on in this game that kind of the goal coming out and starting the game was to get Ilgauskas a shot, the first shot in every game. Did I hear that right? Was that like it seemed like a weird plan to come out and make sure that he got the first shot?
That's such an old school basketball thing. When you're little and you're in a CYO league or high school league, and they're like, "Hey, feed the big man early so he stays involved in the game." Like big men, they won't pay attention to the game unless they take a couple shots early. That's essentially what the implication is, and that's what he felt getting Ilgauskas involved early and got him into the game more. Maybe he felt like he got more of an effort out of him if they did things that way. Mm-hmm. But yeah, they said every game they would start with pretty much the same exact play, with dumping it into Ilgauskas.
Yeah, he got it. He made his first shot too, so it worked out. Early on in this game too, Larry Hughes, who in this game wasn't even certain to play. He was dealing with injuries, but he had two big threes and would actually disappear, I think, the rest of the game. I think he had these two early threes, and then I think he still had 6 points in maybe the third or fourth quarter.
Yeah, and two guys played well in this first quarter, Larry Hughes and Rasheed Wallace.
Yeah.
to the tune of the Pistons, 10-0 points in the paint at one point in this first quarter, and both of them would largely disappear for huge stretches of the game, which was more of an issue, obviously, for the Pistons because Wallace was very integral in what they did.
Well, the biggest moment of first quarter, and in this game maybe even, was a hard foul that Antonio McDyess had on Verjao as he came into the paint. And they hit him with a flagrant 2 and actually ejected him, which it seemed like everybody on the broadcast kind of felt like that might have been a little too much in terms of sending him out of the game. But this was obviously huge because McDyess, while he's kind of a role player at this point in his career, he's in the back end of his career, but he's huge in terms of giving this team minutes off the bench in the paint. And it especially was true in a game like this when you're going to head into double overtime in an even bigger picture in a series like this, which is so tight and everybody's just almost exhausted at this point.
This is an early nominee for Forgotten Play, but I think it's that huge.
Forgotten Play nominee.
Forgotten Play nominee because McDyess, you saw it later in the game. I love Chris Webber. You know that. We've been through that on this podcast at least once. But at this point in his career, to now have to depend on him for as many minutes as they did, I think hurt them later in the game, especially on defense. And that was a role McDyess filled, him and Webber, sort of that, fifth man role for the Pistons. I thought it was a puzzling call because McDyess is not known for that. It's not like he's a guy that had like several warnings throughout the series, and this was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter that, I think you could easily make the case he was going for the ball.
Right.
Was it a hard foul? Sure. Was it a foul that warranted being ejected? I don't think so. And I think the announcers agreed with me.
Yeah, good call on a forgotten play. This is one you wouldn't remember going back and watching this game, but had a huge impact, I think, over the course of the regulation plus 2 overtime. So, even during this, too, they went back and looked at some of the old, or talked about some of the old hard fouls, too, and just kind of how the teammates reacted in previous, I guess, the series the year prior with Detroit was a big one, which there was a hard foul on maybe Ilgauskas, who I think maybe cut his head or something. But LeBron jumped right in the mix in this one, and I think that was maybe part of his maturing early on in his career. And not that he was ever not a great teammate like that, but I think they kind of pointed out like he wasn't quick to do that before, but in this moment he was. He
was right in there defending his guy. And Verjao is one of those guys that you always heard LeBron really liked. He just personally liked Verjao. So I'm sure that played a role in LeBron getting involved. But, hey, stands up for his teammates. You very rarely hear a teammate say anything bad about LeBron.
We go to the second quarter. It's 29-23 after the first quarter. Pistons off to a pretty good start. In this second quarter, you touched on this a little bit earlier in the show, but when LeBron goes to the bench, that's kind of the big question. What are the Cavs going to be able to do? Can they withstand a run by the Pistons when he's on the bench? And they get their first kind of test in this. And this is again a big talking point in this game is what are they going to do while LeBron's on the bench? He's on the bench 4 or 5 minutes midway through this second quarter, and the Pistons really couldn't take advantage. It was kind of almost a push while he was on the bench, and that was huge. That was a big part of the second quarter to stay in the game because they fell down early. If they fall behind, double digits or more, while LeBron's definitely capable of bringing it back, the further you get back on the Pistons, it's much more difficult for this Cavs team to come back.
Look, the Pistons had 2 times in this game to pull away while LeBron was on the bench for an extended period. This was the first of those 2 times. And in both times, we'll get to the other one later, I didn't feel like the Cavs did anything special.
No.
I thought, like you mentioned, the Pistons just couldn't capitalize. But to their credit, they hung in there from a score perspective. You can see the Pistons' defensive game plan changes dramatically with LeBron not in the game. They go more towards a pressuring defensive strategy as opposed to let's collapse and help on LeBron. This was a tale of LeBron being in the game and not being in the game. The first half of the second quarter, when he's not in the game, Cleveland's just trying to tread water, and they go on a little bit of a run towards the end of the second quarter when LeBron's in the game, making everything happen on offense.
Yeah, the Cavs would eventually take the lead with about 2.5 minutes left, and it's pretty even at that point forward. A couple off-the-court things that I really liked about this quarter, or at least caught my attention about this quarter. We had Bob Seger and Kid Rock in the crowd, right? Kid Rock, I think was he at the Malice in the Palace? I can't remember, but he's always at these Detroit Pistons games in the early 2000s.
Of course. Kid Rock, Bob Seger, Eminem. Eminem wasn't there at this game, but when you think
They played
of
his
Detroit,
music coming back.
they played his music a lot. Yeah, of course. So some Detroit connections here in the stands. That was pretty cool.
The other thing I thought was really cool too, Sager had a report from the locker room, the Cavs locker room, where he actually went back. He said, at halftime, here's the plan for the Cavs. And he opened up the door, and they got a couple guys in there, a couple of video editors basically back there pulling game film, cutting it up, and having it ready for the team when they came in the locker room so they could look at it. Now, I was like, where are we right now in this time period? Is this revolutionary in the game, or was this kind of the standard in the NBA? Because I know now, obviously, with video editing software and the technology, you're looking at plays you see on the NFL all the time, like sideline looking at stuff. It's very simple, but it seemed like it was kind of a really unique thing in this moment.
It was unique, I think, to have it turned around that quick. I think that was unique. And Sagers went into this whole plan how the Cavs didn't want their guys sitting around during halftime. They wanted to go from them watching film to having from the coaches watching film to the players having a team meeting, to discuss what they thought went right and wrong in the first half, and then for Brown to come together with the players and talk to them before they took the floor, just to have a plan for halftime, essentially. Maybe they felt that their third quarters, weren't up to par, and they felt they needed a change at halftime, and the video was a big part of that. And I think the quick turnaround of the video was the key to that, to have it ready for the coaches right when they came in the door. What I thought was unique was those two younger guys watching the film, getting it ready as Craig Sager was doing the report. And they tried so hard not to look up. But both those guys, that was their moment right there. And they must have thought that was like the coolest thing ever.
Oh, I'm sure they did. It was all well set up and well executed by Sager, which doesn't surprise me at all. And it's a 1-point game at halftime. And it's funny because we kind of talked about, hey, what this series was in terms of defense and scoring before this game. But if you hadn't watched any other games, like you go back to this game like we did before we went back and did research, you'd know pretty clearly that this was not a high-scoring series. I think every single guy on the broadcast said it at some point late in that second quarter because we had a 52-51 score at halftime that, hey, this is a pretty high-scoring game for these two teams in the way they're playing. We're not used to this. They said it, I think literally Marv, Steve, and even like Craig Sager in his halftime interview. Like everybody had a comment to say about the pace of the game. No,
they each had a comment. They each laughed at each other's comment. And they just made it sound like doing the 4 games previous to this was not fun for them. That the pace of the game was like depressing, and they were like so relieved to finally see a game that had pace and some scoring. It was, you hit it on the head. Like they mentioned it at every turn.
It was just funny. It's one of those things you pick up on during a broadcast. One of the storylines that, you wouldn't probably think twice about, but they hammer it so much that it catches your attention. So third quarter, you touched it. Third quarter was important because the Cavs had not played well. Cavs had struggled in the third quarter. That was something they had to overcome, and they needed to see if it was going to happen. You talked about the halftime changes they made. Well, they come out, and the Pistons go on a 9-2 run to start the third quarter, and it all of a sudden was like, oh, man, here we go again. And again, this is I think probably the point you were talking about a minute ago. This was maybe the second opportunity that the Pistons had to put this game away.
This was their chance to put it away. I thought they could have put it away in a big way here and leading into the first part of the fourth quarter, but they didn't take advantage. And the Cavs find themselves getting right back in the game late in the quarter. You had them going on a 9-2 run. They're showing Chuck Daly and Thomas Hearns and Dominic Hasek in the stands to go along with Kid Rock and Bob Seger before. The crowd is going crazy. It seemed like a big point in the game was when Weber picked up his 4th foul halfway through the quarter, because then we had McDyess already ejected, and I thought that kind of hurt their depth in this quarter. And the Cavs, to their credit, they hang in there, and like I said, they end up tying the game at the end of the quarter. We start to see LeBron start to emerge here a little bit. Still only 7 of 19 for 19 points in this quarter at one point, but he's starting to, you could tell he's starting to give the signs that he's going to bust loose.
Yeah, and they made the point, like LeBron said, like, just get me to the fourth quarter close in this game, and I'll help us win it. And that's exactly what was to come in this game, because they head to the fourth quarter, and again, it's still fairly tight. The Pistons have had their chances to kind of maybe stretch this lead out, but haven't been able to do it. They had a great graphic. showing how close this series had been too. I mean, we've kind of hit it a little bit, but Detroit had a lead to start the fourth quarter in 4 of the 5 games, now including this one as well. But every single lead was within 3 points.
Yeah, the point differential, 3 points or less, I have in my notes going into the fourth quarter of every game. One thing of note also, Rasheed Wallace hasn't scored since the first quarter as we enter the fourth quarter. And Tayshaun Prince, you could argue, like, even kept the game to where the point where it was tied. The Pistons had a very bad last half of the third quarter.
Yeah.
And Tayshaun Prince had 10 points in the quarter. So he's carrying the Pistons on offense at this point also.
Yeah, Tayshaun had a really good game, I think, all around. He's a very, very solid player. And I think this was a solid game for him. Another graphic they had in this quarter that was pretty awesome to see now. It was Steve's Refreshing Thoughts. Okay, this is a Coors Light sponsored element in the broadcast. But who is the only player in the NBA history at this point to win an NBA title before the age of 23 and average 20 or more points in the regular season? And, of course, that would have been Kobe Bryant, who averaged 22.5 points in the year 2000. And here we are on the cusp of LeBron getting to that point. Now, he wouldn't get to that point, but he was close, and the next guy in line that could do it. But it's even now thinking back on it and seeing that LeBron, I guess, could not come through with that and finish up that statistic, and then Jordan couldn't do it. Like, some of the greats that have played, and Kobe still kind of has that throne.
Yeah, similarity between Kobe and LeBron is, I remember the criticism Kobe got at a very young age when it was thought that he couldn't come through in the playoffs in big moments, similar to what LeBron's going through in this series. But you forget, these guys are 22, 23 years old, which is crazy.
And I don't know if anybody's done that since. I mean, I assumed no, but I guess as young as the league has gotten now, that by the time you're 22, you probably played 3-4 years, so it's not out of the ordinary to be at a pretty good spot averaging 20 points per game. So I don't know if it's actually happened since then. But at this point, that was I think a really cool stat they threw up there. Narrative right now, again, is LeBron just doesn't do enough late in games. And we've kind of highlighted it a little bit, but I think they went back and showed earlier games in this series where he didn't take the final shot. And I remember these things because this has been the criticism. I think these kind of early games have kind of stuck with him throughout his career, even though he's quieted him in many respects. But I think the people that still want to hate on LeBron will still kind of point to a few of these games where he didn't take that last shot. And they make it a point to kind of highlight a few of those moments here in this series.
That was the big thing with LeBron, was that not that he didn't have the ball in his hands at the end of the game, was that he had it. And in my opinion, he would make correct basketball plays. Like 3 or 4 guys would converge on him, and they showed at like one point he kicked it to Donyell Marshall in the corner who missed a three-pointer.
Yeah.
That's a good basketball play. And they wanted him to go above and beyond and take control of the game. And that's exactly what they got in the fourth quarter and overtimes in this game.
Yeah, so if you don't remember this game, this is kind of the point where you start really paying attention, because Detroit goes on a 10-0 run here in this fourth quarter, takes a 7-point lead with 3 minutes and 10 seconds left or so. This is about where this is, where LeBron, who's already kind of starting to take over a little bit on Cleveland's side, but it's kind of where he really elevates his game and goes from being, a great player to a superstar and a guy that's really starting to cement his legacy in the game early in his career at 22 years old. But he kind of takes it over here, Mike, and gets him to overtime. But I think the biggest part is as you go forward from this game on, from this kind of moment on, because it was a good back and forth. I mean, I don't know that there was any, and maybe you have a different perspective, I don't know that there's any huge moment one way or the other. I feel like it was a really well-played game where kind of both teams were making shots, we're executing, maybe make a mistake here and there, but it wasn't like you had these huge moments of error or these just ridiculous back and forth huge shots. I mean, it was just good basketball. But I think if you like, the LeBron is the story here more than anything.
LeBron is the story. To put things in perspective here, with from 5 minutes and 30 seconds left in the fourth quarter through the rest of the fourth quarter and both overtimes, no other player on the Cavs hit a field goal besides LeBron James.
Stupid. It really is.
Just as we go through the rest of this game and what happened, just keep that in mind, okay? What really stuck out to me was how the Pistons are keeping pace with him when he's going through this crazy, sort of run he's going on here, right? Yeah. Truly showing, I know it's cliche, but the heart of a champion here. And how close at the end of regulation Chauncey Billups' shot was to going in.
Yeah.
And keeping LeBron from never having any of these moments he's about to have in the overtimes. Because what happened was, after a timeout, LeBron drives and dunks to tie the game with 10 seconds left. This is not the first time Detroit's help defense would be non-existent against him late in the game. And then Billups comes right back with a shot to win it at the end, and it rims out, and it looked like it was halfway down.
Yeah.
But Billups, again, is a guy who we're used to coming up big in these games, and he did so in this one as well.
In overtime, again, just kind of back and forth, but LeBron, he's hitting everything. Not just making every shot, but he's, as I think maybe Sager or Marv Albert put it after the game was over, he showed everything in his repertoire during this game. I mean, it was, long shots. It was kind of fadeaway jumpers. It was mid-range game. It was getting to the basket. I mean, it was everything in this game, and he did it here. He had a big shot to put him up 4 with right around 30 seconds left in overtime. It looked like maybe it was one of these where it's a foot inside the three-point line, contested, kind of a fading to his right, and just buried it, which he was doing much of this game, much of this fourth quarter overtime, double overtime. But I think the biggest, maybe the one mistake that the Cavs made, and they kind of hit on this quite a bit in the game, was, they go up 4, they had the ball back up 2, which LeBron airballed a shot, which you kind of forget about there's some bad
mistake he made.
Well, he missed a few free throws too.
He did, but that airball was the one glaring one.
Yeah, so they actually tie it, but they pointed out the Cavs burned a timeout, right before that, where they got the ball back. And because the Pistons tied it up, they could have had the opportunity with that extra timeout had they saved it, which is what both Kerr and Doug Collins were saying they should have done. Then they would have had a chance with 2 seconds left or 3 seconds left to move it up and advance it to half court and actually be able to run a play there to get a bucket. But instead, they were unable to do that and had to go full court. Good defense by Prince on LeBron, and we head to a second overtime. In the second overtime, Mike, I mean, it's really much the same. It's just watching LeBron kind of right before your eyes become that superstar, quieting a crowd, right? Reacting to the crowd, much like you saw MJ and you've seen Kobe and some of the greats do when they're in that zone, right? Just kind of feeding off that crowd, but also just taking all the life out of them throughout this. I mean, LeBron's doing everything. The only point that wasn't scored was like a free throw, right? I mean, everything else was LeBron all the way from 6 minutes on to the end of this game. And it finishes off with that help defense you talked about. I don't know how LeBron, with 2 seconds left, was able to to slice right down the middle, right down the paint between 3 or 4 Pistons defenders. And he's so strong he can kind of fight through a little bit of contact and is able to get a layup. A layup with 2 seconds left. I mean, how, Mike, do you not do anything you have to do to get that ball out of LeBron's hands? I mean, for him to go up the middle of that defense like that, and maybe it speaks more to him than the Pistons' lack of defense, but I could not believe the way that he just easily, nonchalantly got a layup to end that game.
Yeah, it was like unencumbered is the best way to put it.
Yeah.
He blew by his man, had the ball at the top of the key, blew by his man. No help defense for the Pistons. No one, when someone sort of half-heartedly kind of reaches in on the guy that's driving to the hoop when he goes by you.
Yeah.
It was those kind of moves by a couple Pistons defenders. No one fully stepped in and tried to keep him from getting to the basket. He converts what for LeBron James is a very easy basket. And that culminates this run for LeBron James. 48 points. He scored the last 25 points for the Cavs. 29 of the last 30 points for the Cavs, hit their last 11 field goals. And again, that all took place from 6 minutes left in regulation. And we're now at the end of the second overtime.
Right. Against a team that is in their 5th of 6 straight conference finals on their home court. I mean, it's a huge spot. It's not a home crowd
known
environment.
for their team defense.
Yes, I know, all this stuff. It was a remarkable performance. I guess they call it, I don't know if you knew they called it this, LeBron's 48 special.
I never knew it had a name, but I'm telling you, this is one moment of LeBron's career that I don't think you can talk about enough. Because I think people forget now because he's so established, the question marks that were around him back then. And how even after this game, when he was interviewed by Craig Sager, you could just see the relief on his face.
Right.
like I did it. Like this is a team that has been like a thorn in my side. They're in our division. We lost to them last year, and I just staked my claim that I'm LeBron James and I'm here. You could just see it. Even Sager asked him, "Did you know you were this good?"
Yeah,
and LeBron said no.
Yeah, that was.
That
was a
was
cool
you
moment,
got to prove. Yeah, that was a great question by Craig Sager, as usual from him, which is what we came to expect from him over the years. And when LeBron said no, that was eye-opening. He had to prove it to himself, and he did it in this game. Just a masterful performance.
Yeah, 109-107 the final. The Cavs would go on to win the last game of that series, 98-82, close it out in a very nice fashion in Cleveland and clinch that series. And it was a very big win, kind of a historic win for the franchise. Got them back to the NBA Finals, but they got swept by the Spurs. And to your point, like this was a big moment, Mike, but I even think like until, he left for Miami and went on that run he went on and finally won a couple of championships, like there was still kind of the question where was this more the anomaly than the expected outcome when it comes to LeBron? Because as good as he was in this game, there'd still be a few years before like you finally were like, okay, this guy is really special, at least for some people.
Yeah, I think it was expected they were going to get kind of rolled against the Cavs because, again, rolled against the Spurs in the finals this year just because the Spurs top to bottom had just a much better roster.
Right.
And were even better on defense than the Cavs, than the Pistons were. But, yeah, in the coming years, people would forget really quick about this performance, and it would become again about now can LeBron win a championship? Now can LeBron play good in the playoffs because he would play pretty consistently well in the playoffs, except for some blips against the Celtics, and then later against the Mavericks in the finals when he became a member of the Heat. But he would consistently deal. I think he dealt with that, Ben, to be honest with you, until he beat the Warriors.
Yeah,
I think even when he won with the Heat, I think it was more like, well, you won 2 championships because you had Wade and Bosh and you stacked your team. But then when he beat that Warriors team with a team that was underdog, I think that's when the monkey really got off his back. And we're talking, that's 10 years after this moment we're talking about now.
It's crazy. And you're right, because, the whole thing was, well, you're in Miami and you've even said that you're going to win 3, 4, 5, whatever it was, championships. And, well, you won 2, but not even close to even the expectations you set for yourself. So, in a lot of people's minds, he was even a failure at that point. Now, obviously that's not fair, but that's still kind of what the perception is. I think, yeah, you're right. When they finally came back from that 3-1 deficit to win, that was kind of the game changer for him. But, you look back and it's crazy because the next few years before he would go off to Miami, this team never got back to the NBA Finals. This was his one NBA Finals appearance the first time through with the Cavs. And I kind of forget about that.
Yeah, because they started to run into the Celtics. So the next season, they lost in 7 to the Celtics in the conference semifinals. The year after that, they lost in the Eastern Conference Finals to the Magic. Remember that?
Hey,
okay.
Forget about that, but yeah.
Yep. And then in 2009, 2010, LeBron had a very disappointing series against the Celtics in the Eastern Conference semifinals, which is a big-time black mark on his career, that series. And then the next year, he was off to Miami.
Yeah.
So there was the thinking in that series in 2009 against the Celtics that he kind of quit. So that was a big black mark on his career until he would win his first championship. So things did not end well for LeBron in Cleveland. You could argue that this was the best moment of his first run in Cleveland.
Right.
And it was kind of all downhill from there as far as, public perception-wise. But throughout this whole time, LeBron is just turning into, like, one of the best players ever.
Yeah.
That year they lost to the Magic. What made it so disappointing is they were like 66-16 during that regular season.
Yeah, they won 60 games each of those last 2 years, which is part of the reason why people were so upset with him leaving without, getting to that pinnacle with teams that were winning that many games. But, regardless, we know what LeBron's done since. And on the other side of this too, the Pistons, we're focused here on LeBron for obvious reasons, but you look at the Pistons too. LeBron closed out their dynasty. Not, this was a part of it, but the Pistons would go on, make the conference finals again, but they would run into the Celtics the next year. And then the Cavs would sweep them in the first round of the NBA playoffs in 2009. And then from that point, Mike, this has been, I mean, one of the worst NBA franchises over the past 12 years. Two playoff appearances, and only two winning seasons since that time. That's crazy.
Yeah, they've been through some lean years for sure. I mean, this is just, they caught lightning in a bottle with this group, because even when they got this group together with Billups, Wallace, Hamilton, and Prince, I think this run sort of came out of nowhere, sort of like the Warriors run did, for that 5 or 6 years where the Warriors were on top of the league.
Yeah.
One of those pleasant surprises for a really loyal fan base. I think there's a lot of parallels between those. Probably the only parallels between those two runs. But hopefully the fans in Detroit enjoyed those years, because it's been rough since then.
It has. A few outdated items. I got a couple on my list. We'll see what you have. But they got a shot of Chris Paul in this game, and it was, Chris Paul now is like the grizzly old veteran in the league. But even going all the way back then, he was a year removed from his Rookie of the Year season in the NBA, which, man, it's just, you go back all the way to that time, and just having him and LeBron and a couple other guys that are still in this league over that period of time is really impressive.
Yeah, he looked so young, didn't he?
Yeah.
And this is the year, Ben, where I don't know if you remember this story, when we both worked at ESPN, he was there shooting a commercial on the outside basketball court. He came into the building where we worked. He asked me where the bathroom was, and I thought he was a worker. Because people would play basketball, just give people perspective, and I thought he was a worker who needed to use the bathroom. I'm like, how does this guy not know where the bathroom is?
Did you at least help him?
I did, yeah.
Okay.
And then afterwards, I realized he had a full uniform on, because they tape those commercials in full uniform.
Wow, you were not checked in right at that day, were you?
Who knows? I was probably exhausted. You know how it was there. You worked a million hours, but yeah. So that must have been right around this time, because he was dressed in his. I think he was like on the Hornets or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So, you got any more?
Yeah, I'll throw one more out there to you. T-Mobile had a commercial for their Fave 5, and this is going to be probably mind-blowing to a lot of younger people listening, but T-Mobile had it set up to where you could identify your 5 favorite people in your contact list, and you got free minutes for all those people in your contact list. Otherwise, you're obviously paying for a plan that includes a certain amount of minutes a month. I even thought you had to go further back than that to get to the minutes, these minute accounts under your cell phones. But the fact that there were still, even 13 years ago, there were plans in which you were having to watch your minutes diligently. And I don't even know that I've used 1,000 minutes since that game, Mike. I mean, that's how little I actually talk on the phone versus texting.
Now, you were a T-Mobile guy, weren't you?
I was for a long time, yeah.
You were. I made a mark to make sure everyone finds out that Ben was a T-Mobile guy.
I guess I may have still been a T-Mobile guy at this point. I don't really remember the transition. I definitely don't remember having a My 5. Definitely don't remember.
That was going to be my follow-up question. Who was in your Fave 5?
Yeah, and it's funny, Mike, because when that commercial first started, did you see this commercial first of all?
Yeah.
Did you actually watch it? You didn't skip through it?
No, I watched it. I didn't skip through it. Yep.
When it first started, I thought it was a MySpace commercial. I for a brief second, I was like, did MySpace advertise because you had your favorite? I don't remember what it was. You had your top. It might have been more than 5. Was it 9, 10? I don't even remember what it was. But you identified your top friends, right? Yeah. And they were listed out. I thought this was a MySpace commercial briefly.
That's funny. And of course, MySpace, man. That was it back then, though. And then
I think I still have a profile floating out there on the internet somewhere. I should probably delete that.
And then remember, these T-Mobile Fave 5 commercials became known for Barkley and Dwayne Wade in the coming years.
There you go.
They were heavily in those commercials. So,
also PS1, PlayStation 1 was advertised during this game too. Boy, we've come a long way since that as well. You have anything outdated?
All right, so I had the T-Mobile Fave 5 commercial. I also had David Wright and MLB 07 The Show.
Of course you did.
David Wright, man. That was back when David Wright, you're like, man, the Mets are going to have an iconic player. How awesome is this? And then you didn't know that was as good as he was going to be. So, of course, typical Mets.
Yeah, that was a good one. What if wise? I mean, I think for me, what if in this game was, what if McDyess doesn't get ejected in this game? Does his impact make a difference? Is it worth 2 points, give or take, right, in this game, or even 1 point to avoid overtime? And then again, I think you kind of touched on it briefly. I hadn't thought about it until you did. But what if Chauncey Billups makes that shot into regulation? What is the narrative with LeBron then if he doesn't come back and win this game? They might still win the series, but they're down 3-2 now, and had another finish where they kind of didn't give it away, but they couldn't close it out when they had the opportunity to. What does that change?
Yeah, Chauncey Billups is already known for coming up big in clutch spots because he was so great during that title run. If that shot ever goes down, his lore is even expanded even more. So that was a very good what if. And the McDyess one I had also, and it's hard to explain. People might be thinking, well, how big of a deal could Antonio McDyess possibly be? But it just took a player out of the rotation and it hurt them during the game. It's one of those things, if you watch the game, I think you could understand it a little bit better. It just made them thinner than they typically were. And he did provide a little bit of offensive spark for them too.
Yeah.
Those are the biggest what ifs for me. The only other what if I could think of is what if the Pistons won, could they have challenged the Spurs better in the finals?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that question, but I think in the end, the best player won this series, and that's why it's so thought of highly for LeBron, but that maybe the best team didn't.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, a good what if, and that's why we say the what ifs. We don't know what they would have been, but it's something to think about, and that's why we try to do more what if series too on our YouTube channel as well. So if you haven't checked that out, do so. We got a what if Drew Brees would have signed with the Dolphins instead of the Saints, but it's kind of what we try to do on each one of these episodes, and something to think about. And it's why we go back and watch these old games, Mike, not to just waste time, but to also just kind of think about how history could have changed for teams, for players, for fans, all this stuff. So good game. LeBron's 48 special, huge performance, and knocked the Pistons out of the playoffs essentially, and got Cleveland to their first finals in a long time. But it would be a while before he won one in Cleveland. That'll do it for us on this episode of the podcast. Again, if you haven't, a couple ways to stay in touch with us on YouTube. You hit subscribe there. Please do subscribe to the show there. We'd love to have you part of the community that we're starting to create. Some great listeners, great comments. And also we're doing some additional content on the YouTube channel as well that we're not going to put on the podcast feed, a little bit different. So if you want to go more into depth in sports and in history, join us on the YouTube channel. But wherever you listen on the podcast, please subscribe there, rate, review, spread the word, tell a friend, and tell an enemy. Heck, we don't care. It doesn't matter to us. And spread the word on the show. We appreciate it. But Twitter and Instagram as well. And again, we'll put the game up on DisToReplayPodcast.com so you can go back and watch LeBron's performance over the Pistons in the 2007 Eastern Conference Finals. Mike, enjoyed it.
Tell an enemy. Until next time.